Yes. Well, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on wherever you're joining us online and here in the room. My name is Omar Sadr, and I'm a senior research scholar at the Center for Governance and Markets. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all, but particularly welcome Dr. Mirwais Balkhi, who has joined us from far away in Washington, here at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Balkhi, of course, he's a public figure in Afghanistan. He doesn't need an introduction, but for those who may not know, here in the US, he is currently a visiting fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, DC. Earlier, he was Minister of Education of Afghanistan under the first phase of National Unity Government. And also a visiting scholar, former visiting scholar of international relations and Middle Eastern studies at Georgetown University, Qatar. Today, he's going to talk about the Balkh School of Islamic Thought, an approach towards pluralist coexistence of the Muslim world. And I think this is a quite crucial and important topic at this age, not only for Afghanistan, but also broader for Islamic world, and here even in the West, where we are increasingly facing polarized societies, plus religious extremism. A bigger question is how to counter religious extremism. There have been so many practices of counterinsurgency and counter-religious extremism, extremism, but the approach that today Dr. Balkhi is presenting us is based on one of his papers published earlier, and he is what he calls it kind of bottom-up, intra-religious approach to counter radicalism, like that of Daesh or IS and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, floor is yours. You will have, I don't know, more than 20 minutes, 20 to half an hour. Feel free to share your thoughts with us, and then we will have a question and answer session following that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Omar. It's a pleasure to be here in the Center for Governance and Market. Dr. Umar talked about a crucial question, I think, which is the central theme in the international relations, peace and conflict studies, that how we counter Islamic terrorism, not only in the Islamic countries, but also overall in the global aspect. I would not say religious terrorism, because I believe that every religion is different in methodology. That's why I always prefer to talk about Islamic terrorism, which the term reflects what I have also in my mind. There might be a question for all who are interested in Islamic terrorism, that how and why the phenomena is prevailing in across the globe. I would not go into details for that, but in general understanding, to deliver my own perspective about the reasons behind how the Islamic terrorism is prevailing nowadays in the global scenario, is the miscalculation of the global politics during the Cold War, and also the instrumental use of Islamic terrorism during the regional Cold War at the end of the global Cold War. Because as in the paradigm of Cold War, everything was branded as Western and Eastern. As such, Islam was also divided between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. We have the political Islam, which was Western prone, and we have the mysticism Islam, or the Sufi Islam, which was Eastern prone. That is why when in the competition of power politics, the disintegration of the Soviet happened, the Sufi Islam was also banished or went into the margin of the interpersonal beliefs and as a system of beliefs among the Muslim Ummah or Muslim community. That is why we have, as a result of the strategic miscalculation, the Islamic terrorism, which as a phenomenon is threatening everyone. I do not talk about the Islamic societies only because I believe that nowadays individually we have the feeling of fear from the Islamic terrorism wherever we are. That's why actively that the challenge is there, and in potential the threat is also prevailing everywhere, even in the United States of America. When we are here, at least in our mind, we have always a potential feelings of fear that something may happen potentially or actively by the Islamic terrorist organizations that we have. So the question is how to counter, because it might be a very old question, because 60 years at least the world is busy for how to counter the Islamic terrorism. We have different kinds of approaches. At least when we survey the literature, we have the preventive approaches, we have the punishment legal approaches, we have certain offensive approaches, all kinds of pressures, carrot and stick approaches have been used to counter terrorism, from the political pressure, to economic pressure, to military missions, to attacks, all kinds of mechanisms and approaches. But what I believe is that the result and the consequence of all the traditional, conventional approaches resulted to the short-term treatment. For a short period, in a specific place, maybe the terrorism challenges were reduced. But in the foundation, we could not solve the issue, the problem. Why? That's a question. Because if all types of approaches did not work to tackle Islamic terrorism, then of course there would be a question or to somehow rethink about all the approaches and mechanisms how to tackle the Islamic terrorism. For me, when I was looking at bottom-up approach for Islamic terrorism's controlling, then I thought that all these conventional approaches that we have, they have a single problem or a single challenge in it, and that is the trans-religious approach towards tackling a religious trend everywhere. Because those who are working on peace and conflict studies, those who are working for military apparatus, those who are working in countering the religious movements, the radicalism, they have a very simple understanding of the religion. Majority of them, they think that religion is a system of beliefs and that's it. That is why if you are somehow counter that system of belief, then that would be easy. You can control the radicalism, you can control the terrorism. But when I study religion, and when I practice, when I face religious people, then I come to an understanding that we have to have an in-depth understanding of religion. For me, religion is a set of emotions, rituals, practices. It impacts the spirit of the people. It impacts the behaviors of the people. It impacts the thinking of the people. So if there is a motivation which impacts the spread, behaviors, and thinking of the people, it relates with the emotions of the people, then it would be very easy to think a trans-religious approach to tackle radicalism out of that religious thinking. That is why I think later on, the think tanks and also the countries, also they came to this understanding that they cannot challenge Islamic terrorism by preventive or offensive approaches. That is why they were also thinking a sociological approach. And you are familiar with the counter-narrative approach. Everyone was talking about counter-narrative approach. They were thinking that through portraying an alternative picture, then that would be easy to remove the radicalism from Islamic societies and replace that portrayed picture, and then you will make everything settled and you have a peaceful life. But counter-narrative is also a problem. Especially, it could not meet the expectations to tackle the Islamic terrorism. That's why in the beginning I told you that Islam is different in methodology. In counter-narrative, the new narrative itself for the radical Muslims is an innovation. And you know that innovation according to the Islamic Sharia itself is heresy. When you are bringing something new out of Sharia, you have added something from the heresy to the religion. That is why there is a fundamental understanding from the text by the Islamic radicalism that kullun bid'atun zalala and kullun zalalatun haram. All whatever we have as an innovation is evil, and evil is permissible. That is why when you talk about counter-narrative, that is a very intellectual understanding of religion again. You want to define certain pictures, certain writings, certain stories new based on your own understanding, and then you want to replace with the religious foundations. That is why I believe that the counter narrative also did not work. So I always say when people are busy with making counter narratives to put alternative narratives to the Islamic fundamentalism or principalists, they are all working in vain. And they are wasting their time to tackle, again, through trans-religious approaches to control a religious trend in any part of the world. I don't care whether it's Islamic societies or it's out of the Islamic societies. So that is why I thought it is time to reconsider all the current approaches to control or to reduce or to defend the Islamic terrorism. That was my question. And that is because I always say that we have to solve the issue once and for all. If you are talking some specific time, specific location, with specific groups of the Islamists, that would not resolve the issue. The challenge will remain in potentials, and it will again rise in some other places, and again the challenge will remain on the ground. So that is why when I say reconsider, then the question will again arise, how? How to reconsider the approach? I was thinking we had a Persian proverb, and all of you know that the proverbs, they have a wisdom, a historical experience behind that. And that Persian proverb is that you can destroy a poison by antidote. زهر با پادزهر نابود می‌گردد. And that's a very ancient proverb we have in our region, that the poison can be destroyed by antidote. So that's why I was thinking, if the trans-religious approach do not work to tackle Islamic terrorism, then how we can use this simple proverb to use as a mechanism, as an approach to defend, to fight Islamic terrorism. And that is why I also believed, as an hypothesis, I also believe that if we want to cure the poison of Islamic terrorism, we have to find a new narrative of antidote, or at least a narrative as an antidote to destroy the Islamic terrorism. So when I saw the internal conflicts of the Islamists in the Islamic world everywhere, then I understood that it is all fighting of narratives, different methodologies, because all Muslims are common in the principles. Anyone, based on the legitimacy of the institutions, based on the principles of the Islamic religion, whoever is he, intellectual, modern, any other kind that you have, all different typologies we have of the Muslims also as like other religions, but they are all common in principles. You do not have differences in principles, but in methodology, yes. You have all types of the Islamists and groups and individual. And that's why in the narratives, they are fighting against each other. So when I came to the narratives, taking the question of Islamism, Islamic terrorism, I came to the conclusion that we have two dominant narratives in the Islamic world. Two dominant narratives. All other narratives are time-bound or based on the perspectives of the scholars, perspectives of the activists, or anyone who is concerned about the Islamic terrorism. But overall generalization is divided in two narratives. One narrative is the Islamism. Anyone who concerns about application of Sharia in the society. Anyone who is concerned for the application of Sharia in the society is for me an Islamist. No matter who is he, if he's fighting politically, if he's fighting militarily, if he's fighting through irshad, if he's fighting through any means that we have, through media, through social media, through any other means. But on the other side, we have a moderate narrative. A Muslim who is concerned individually about his beliefs. He is not following the application of Sharia as a necessity for, or as an obligation, as Islamic obligation. That's why these two narratives are fighting in the Islamic world since at least 60 years. Why I say 60 years? Because I talk about the new paradigm in the global politics. Otherwise, these narratives have been since the beginning of Islam. But based on the new parameter, based on the new mechanisms, new understanding, new terminologies, new epistemological understanding, the narratives are divided between the Islamism and the moderation. So in these two narratives, what I said in the beginning, because of the global politics of the Cold War paradigm, the moderation and the moderate narratives are at margin nowadays. It is sidelined. And the political Islamists gain power, gain fame, and they become more active, and they are more pragmatist, and they are visible in each and every places, in the Islamic societies and outside the Islamic societies. So the political Islamists, especially, they themselves also divided in two categories. One category, they are political Islamists. They are following political approach, political means, especially the modern political approach to establish an Islamic Sharia-based societies, like Muslim Brotherhood, like anyone. You have different organizations in the Islamic societies. But two other Islamists are the Assad Islamists, which are supported by the state sponsorship of the terrorism in our region because of the regional Cold War, by the regional power, and you have the militant Islam, the Jihadist Islamists. So these two, Assad Islamists and the militant Islamists, they have a new Kharijite theology based on the takfiri approach. That is the dominant narrative of the Islamists nowadays. The new Kharijite, who was always following two agendas. I do not go into the details of the Kharijite, new Kharijite. You better know they are the secessionist people from the mainstream Islam who are looking for the pure Islam. No any kind of accommodation, no compromise, to fight until you reach your ideological objectives. So then the new Kharijite takfiri groups, which is a dominant narrative of the Islamists, they have two agendas. One, to defeat any Muslim rulers who fail to apply Sharia in their societies, and also the Muslims who are following these rulers. That is why killing, suicide bombing, attacking mosques, mobs everywhere is permissible according to their narrative, because they are supporting, even as a citizen, the rulers who fail to establish Sharia. That is why in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in all almost Islamic world, they are attacking anyone. Sometimes we complain that why they are attacking masjids, the mosques, but in their narratives, that's permissible, justified, because these are a bunch of Muslims who are supporting the rulers who fail to apply Sharia in their society. So that's very much justified. And the second agenda, to defeat those who are hindrance to the application of Sharia and prevailing democracy and secularism, which means non-Islamic world. Not only the government apparatus, not the bureaucrat, every single citizen of the non-Islamic countries who are creating hindrance to apply Sharia in the Islamic societies. So both are the targets. Islamic societies, non-Islamic societies, Muslim bureaucrats, non-Muslim bureaucrats, Muslim citizens, non-Muslim citizens. Even out of this narrative, you can have a new definition of security, which I believe that can be under the framework of the Copenhagen School of Security. That is why there is a prevailing feeling of fear, what I was talking about. So, in that kind of situation, the new Kharijite takfiri approach has two main sources: the text and the narration, riwayah. You have a single Islam, which is based on the text, and the text interpretation is based on the historical narration, riwayah. Out of that, there is no a single legitimate source to justify their behaviors and thinking. Even the Taliban in Afghanistan, some people, they say why they are not defining a new constitution for the Imarat Islami of Afghanistan. I would say how a new Kharijite approach, which is based in principle on the text and narration, will think about a constitution. Even if they define a constitution, that would be kind of play and game because of the pressures, because of certain obligations that internationally they have. Otherwise, the charter and constitution of the new Kharijite approach is Quran. What kind of Quran? The historical narration of the Quran based on a single riwayah. And that riwayah is based on certain ulamas, which they talk about always how to apply Sharia in any cost in an Islamic society. So that is the situation that we have. That is why, in my mind, the conventional approach are failed. The counter-narrative approach is a failure. Then what to do? There was a question in my mind, whether we have to sit and see what happens, or we have to look any potential alternative so that we can at least find a way to put an end to the Islamic terrorism. That is why in my mind, I was thinking, if counterterrorism does not work, it's an innovation, it's better. At the same time, if the historical or the conventional approaches do not work, let's use this proverb: to destroy a poison, you have to make an antidote. And that's why I was thinking, okay, do we have antidote from the Islamic interpretation, from a bottom-up approach? I was going to the historical texts, and I found an old narrative which historically was succeeded against the old Kharijite of the time. If you remember, in the 2nd, 3rd century of Islamic civilization, we had a prevailing Kharijite movement in Khorasan. The Sistan was the epicenter of the Kharijite. And you had the greatest historical figure of our region. They were influenced by the Khariji movement. Some of the champion of our history, national history, for example, you have Yaqub Safari. He was a Kharijite. Hamza Sistani, he was a Kharijite. Abdul Karim Ajrat, Khalid ibn Maymoon, and many great scholars, rulers of that time, when we talk about them, they were influenced by the Kharijite theology. And the whole region was under the attack of the Khariji movement. But a group of the theologians, they came together in Balkh region. When I talk about Balkh, that is the historical Balkh, which some people, they say it starts from Hindu Kush until Hisar in Tajikistan. So it covers a larger area traditionally. They sat together And based on the essence of or theology of the Balkh, they talked about how to counter this Kharijite movement. So that is why I talked about the revival of an old narrative. The revival of an old narrative to counter today's Islamist or Islamic terrorism narrative. So again, there would be a question that we had many old narratives. We have the Egyptian narrative. We have the Medina narrative. We have the Iraq narrative. We have the Deoband Indian subcontinent narrative. We have traditionally many sources and many narratives. Why not reviving those narratives to fight Islamic terrorism? That's why comparatively I was studying on all those traditional narratives. What I came as a conclusion was that all these narratives of the time, except the Balkh School of Theology, ended into reincarnation of the Islamic terrorism. The Deobandi, you have the new Salafi political Islam, which we have in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Egyptian narrative resulted into the political Islam of al-Jihad, al-Jihad Islami, and even the radical branch of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Then the Medina resulted to Wahhabism, what you have now as a even state official sect of Saudi Arabia. And the Iraq also is the same, resulted into extremism and radicalism in the Islamic world. But what I did not see even a single evidence is that from the Balkh Theological School, there is no any political Islamist offshot. It was downsized, sidelined, marginalized in the Cold War between the Soviet and the Western Bloc. Especially even now, the essence of that theological understanding remained in the Central Asian countries and in parts of Afghanistan. So that is why I thought if the same theological narrative countered Islamic terrorism once, the revival of the old narrative can also counter today's Islamic terrorism. Why? Because when I looked at the parameters of the Balkh Theological School, I found at least 5 important parameters which talks about all aspects of today's human life: sociology, economics, history, politics, and theology. These, I believe, are the major aspects of a social movement in anywhere. Even if you talk about liberalism, Marxism, pragmatism, any ism that you have conventionally in the social sciences. What are these 5 parameters? I found we have, in the Balkh Theological School, we have a pragmatist mysticism. We have mysticism, but that's pragmatist. Because the Sufis and the Arifs of Khorasan, they were not passive Sufis like the Murtaz and like the hermits of, the Greece traditionally we had, or in India and China. No. The Sufis and the Arifs in our region were very much practical. They had their own circles, they had their own charities, they had their own teaching classes, and they were very much practical in the society. Even they were fighting. Some of them, they fought against the Chinggis invasion that time, Chinggis Khan. So that is why they were all looking for a mysticism coexistence in that region. The second parameter, apolitical Murji'ism. This is one of the major parameters of the Balkh theological school, that they are apolitical when it comes to the beliefs and practice. That's why people, they talk about secularism. They want to somehow exclude narration out of the political activities. That is secularism. In Murji'ism theology, when there was political clashes among the Muslims, even the early Muslims, clashes between the companions of Prophet Muhammad, clashes between Muawiyah and Ali, clashes between the rulers, among the rulers, the Murji'is of Balkh, they said, it's none of our business. That is their political activities. And it does not impact our belief and iman. Belief is different, practice is different. So if Ali is fighting against Muawiyah, that is their issues. And hereafter, they will respond to the judgment. We are Muslim, true Muslim, and that's our iman. So iman is something very much abstract within individual Muslim. Even if you do not put it in practice, your iman is complete. That is why the Balkh region did not intervene in the clashes we had in Iraq, we had in Mecca and Medina, we had in the traditional motherland of the Islamic civilization. The third parameter is the Karamite coexistence. Karamiya, we say in Farsi and Arabic. Karamiya is, again, a theological way where Muslims, they believe that the God is the merciful who will forgive the sin of any human being. Rumi is now a figure, a global figure. He is a Karamite or Karami. He says, no unbelievers will remain in fire, in hell. No one will remain there for the punishment. And the certain theology was prevailing among the people in that region within the framework of the Balkh theological school. That is why the Jew, the Zoroastrian, the Hindus, and Muslims were living peacefully for centuries in that region. Only, I think it was 1952, the Jew from that region, they migrated to Israel. They were living there. And the Hindus, though small minority, still they are living there. Because that theological school was prevailing in that time, and it was a dominant school for, I always say, until the Cold War, or until King Zahir Shah in Afghanistan, which is the dominant prevailing official theology of the state. But of course, at the margin, there was again counter narratives which was coming from the Deoband and which was coming from the Salafi narratives of the Arab world and also India subcontinent. The fourth narrative is the middle way, i'tidal. The ulama of Balkh, they were very much famous for their middle way understanding of Islam and practices. That is why in the historical sources, when they talk about the Balkh theological school, then they talk about i'tidal. It's something middle, no extreme at all. That is why the theological region was excluding an extremist radical from their circles. That is why Maturidi we have was very famous. That is why the Karamite was famous, Marji was famous. And these theological schools, which did not have a place in other parts of the Islamic world, was very much active in that society. And the last parameter was that historically this Balkh was the melting pot of religions. Historically, before Islam came to the region, there were many religions living together. The Zoroastrians with the Buddhists, the Hindus, Jews and Christians, they were living together. And there were small minor religions also reported in the sources, which may had like, count finger followers, individual followers. But that was there, that kind of historical experiences living together in a coexistential approach without posing any challenge against each other. So these 5 parameters, if you put it as a narrative, as an old narrative, and put it with the modern mechanisms of how you can define a narrative, how you can make it modern, how you can make it update, that can be a strong narrative to fight terrorism from a bottom-up approach, to challenge the foundations of Islamic radicalism or terrorism, and also the behaviors and practices that they are following on the daily basis. That is the main thesis to fight Islamic terrorism. That's it, Dr. Umar.
Questions?
موضوع اساس روی نظر شما می‌خواستیم که داشته باشیم. یک وقت من سمینار رو اشتراک کرده بودیم در اونجا راجع به تروریسم یک کنفرانس در یک سمینار اشتراک کرده بودیم راجع به تروریسم بین‌المللی و تروریسم فرهنگی و در این صحبت می‌شد و در اونجا آمده بود توی مشاهده کنم که تروریست‌های که قبل از تروریسم بودن که بعد از مدت یا سریع نظامی یا به شکل دشتار می‌آیند حکومت تصرف می‌کنند و خودشان حکومت داریم. سوال در این است، سالمی گروه طالبان که شما می‌شناسید در گروه تروریستی اینا آمدن قدرت داشتن به شکل نظامی یا رقمی که بود. سوال این است، سال در دراز مدت اینا را جامعه بین‌المللی به رسمیت بشناسد. با همین جرایم کنار انجام دادیم که مطابق قانون نافذی کشور ما و قوانین بین‌المللی جرایم سنگین است که متوجه مجازات است. اگر اینا را به رسمیت بشناسد، خیلی اعمال اقدار به اینا به حساب ما لیگال حساب می‌کنیم که اینا را انجام دادن بسیار خوب است. و از نگاه حقوق بین‌الدول چه رقم شمایی را نظرتان که همین مناسبات چه رقم تنظیم خواهد شد برای این؟
Do we have to translate it?
If you'd like to give a very brief translation of that, just so some of our English-speaking audio members.
Yeah, the question is, in case when militant Islamists take over government, at the same time they have committed international crimes and atrocity, how do we deal with them once they are acting as a state? For instance, in the case of Taliban, for 20 years they were engaged in insurgency and definitely they committed international mass atrocity. Now they have taken over government of Afghanistan. How the international law and international community should consider them?
Yeah, so based on my definition of the Islamists, first of all, they always challenge the current global system. They do not believe in Westphalian system of nation state. They are looking for their own ideals, which all talks about the Islamic Ummah, talks about cross boundaries, movements, interactions with others, and eventually establishing Islamic Khilafah. So Islamists, whether they control the state or not, are Islamist. And I put it always as a Islamic terrorism. Any means except fighting militarily against them to counter and put them at the margin for not misusing the power, not threatening the life of the citizens, is the only option. But that is not to counter the terrorism. That is only so that they do not misuse the state apparatus and the governmental power for threatening the life of the people. Otherwise, any kind of engagement with an Islamic state who are ideologically following their own ideals is a danger, not only to the Muslims in that society, but also to the Islamic global system, international security. That is why you cannot justify any action of these groups, whether it did before they come to power or after when they come to power. My next thesis that I'm working nowadays is the Taliban itself, because the global community, they are using all kinds of mechanisms to engage with the Taliban. They believe that the Taliban, they will be changed. That's another paper that I wrote, will Taliban be civilized? And I justified they will not be. That is why it will be wasting time to give a pilot project for some time to see if a part of the Taliban are tamed, then there are possibilities to work with the Taliban for a civilized or for a civil government, or to turn them from radical Islamism to the little bit moderate. That's a wasting time. So that is why until or unless when they have the power to pose challenges to the citizens and to the life of the human being in the international system, military is the only option. I always focus on military. Otherwise, if you want to sideline the narrative itself, this is the approach that I talked about.
Yes. Does the Balkh Theology School confirm political secularism?
If you take the Murji'i theology, which I talked about as a parameter of the Balkh Theological School, it talks about secularism, but not in the philosophical way. Because in the philosophical way, secularism means you do not intervene any text into the day-to-day life, or especially in the governance. But if you take it as a practical way, the Muslims in Murji'a or Murji'a theology, they say that if in the governance they have a kind of secular implementation of the rules for the betterment of the ummah or the citizen life, it does not affect the principles of Iman. That can be a kind of Islamic secularism.
Thank you, Dr. Asad, for this great presentation. I learned a lot of things. Just two short questions. Based on your idea, it will be much better to be fight with extremist groups ideologically or physically by military forces, especially in some countries which is still they have conflicts like Afghanistan, some other parts of the world. The other issue that I would like to ask your opinion is that extremist groups, they have a lot of resources comparing to intellectuals or comparing to those who are working for enlightenment or for liberal ideas or for human rights and other values. So they have millions of dollars on their hand. They have their own mafia groups. They have a lot of things. But the intellectuals in every nation, especially if we say about Afghanistan, we don't have much resources to fight against all those groups. So what is your opinion? So we are very weak comparing to them.
Mm.
And by considering this, what should we do?
Regarding your first question, when you fight militarily, you can destroy the organization of the Islamists, but you cannot fight the narrative militarily. That's why I talked about the failure of the approaches. So, to destroy the organization of the Islamists, military is the only option. That's what I responded to Sarah also. But to counter the narrative, you have to revive the old narratives which experienced in the history of Islam, at least. That is why counter narrative is not working, but reviving the old narrative is the only way to counter the Islamist narrative. Military is for destroying the organization. Regarding your second question, when I talk about countering the Islamist or the Islamic terrorism, I talk on the global scale, not only in Afghanistan, because the narrative targets everyone. There's no difference between me and Brain, no different at all. I'm the person who failed to implement Sharia, or I support the ruler who did not implement Sharia. So I'm justified to be killed easily. And Barian is spreading democracy and secularism. That's the hindrance for implementation of Sharia society. But countering Islamic or Islamism narrative is a global responsibility. That is a responsibility for all, because it is not concise within Afghanistan. Taliban are not concise within Afghanistan. You have TTP, you have Taliban of Tajikistan, you have all different offshoots of Taliban who are active and in practice and also in potential in around Afghanistan.
We have to act globally.
That is why the global amount of the source is not comparable. And in front of that, the Taliban, they do not have anything. That is why when we talk about the war of narratives, we have to think about the global scale for that. And that is workable. And one more thing I have to say that in that narrative, what I propose is basically a cultural-oriented fiqh. A cultural-oriented fiqh. That is again an essence of the Balkh theological school, because the fiqh was based on the culture, on the custom, on urf. But in Islamist narrative, it is Sharia-based fiqh. The fiqh is basically on the foundation of the Sharia, and that Sharia is the interpretation of the narrative that they inherited from their figures. So that is why I do not think only about Afghanistan, because the narrative is not national. The scale of the narrative is global, whether Islamist or the moderate narrative. So that scale, if you talk, then the amount and the budget is not comparable.
Thank you, Dr. Asif, for such an informative and eloquent presentation. I just have a quick question that, if I understood you correctly, you stated in parts of your presentation that the Balkh School was largely undermined as a result of the Cold War, which means that before Cold War, they were a dominant school in areas in Afghanistan and Iran. But if you see, since the rise of modern Afghanistan in the 80s, under the Cold War, sometime in mid-20th century, we don't see a major role played by the Balkh School on the political and social affairs of Afghanistan. Social, maybe, but not political. We see that center is mostly modernist, trying to implement a certain modern and developmental agendas. But on the other hand, the center is largely countered by a group of very reactionary and conservative elements within and without the royal family. And without the royal family being the very conservative clergy, the dominant one being the Mujahidi family and others. When we were talking that the military and political Islamists, for them the constitution is Quran or Hadith, I remember Mujahidi once upon showing Quran and the normal of Amanullah and Quran and asking people which one you consider as your constitution, the normal something made by Amanullah or Quran, the sayings of God. So the question is, why don't we see the influence of Balkh School in political affairs of Afghanistan, at least, before the Cold War? Is the explanation is because, as you mentioned, as one of the parameters, because the Balkh School was apolitical, or is the explanation somewhere else, maybe because the school was not that much dominant or whatever?
Yeah, so when I talk about the sphere of the influence of Balkh Theological School, it does not talk about the political boundaries of today's modern states, because the epicenter of this theological school is basically the Central Asian states or Central Asian societies, and also Afghanistan, larger part of Afghanistan. But from 19th century, there was a clash of Balkh Theological School with Deobandi Theological School. Because when during Tazar, the travel of the ulama was put some restrictions so that people, they go to Bukhara, which was that time the epicenter of that, and Samarkand. People or the ulama, they chose another destination. They went to Deoband. What they brought with themselves was the Deobandi Theological School, which is an amalgamation of the Salafism of Shah Waliullah Muhaddis Dehlavi and a political Islam of Ubaidullah Sindhi to fight against colonialism or against the British India. So that is what in Afghanistan, when we came down to the contemporary history, you will see the stream of the Deobandi theological school in the behaviors and thinking of the rulers of Afghanistan, even from King Abdurrahman Khan, who was following the Deobandi narrative match. But until the Cold War, it was like a competition. No, not the Deobandi, nor the Balkh Theological School was the dominant. Both were competing each other. That is why in during some of the rulers in Afghanistan, you could see the Khorasanid theological thinking, which is, I say, the Balkh one. But then sometimes some of the rulers, they were pro-Deobandi theological school. That is why it was a competition. But in the ground society, the majority of the people, they were the followers of the Balkh Theological School. That is why the curriculum the rituals, the thinking of the people, the coexistence of the people were based on these theological schools. But during the Cold War, when all these shifted towards the subcontinent, then the rituals also changed, the curriculum also changed, and it resulted in a new set of mind, thinking, and behaviors. That is why I take Cold War as a turning point, because after Cold War, then there was no competition. The Deobandi Theological School has been the dominant theology of Afghanistan and the official religion of the state from that time. That's my justification.
One question that I may have is probably two questions. I rephrase what Mirwais Balkhi asked. If you can tell us in which age, particularly, Balkh School of Theology were influential in terms of shaping societies. You spoke about the competition between two happening in late 19th century with the Russian colonialism, but Balkh School of Theology is about peaceful mutual coexistence of different communities, creeds, sects together. Do we have any particular era in Middle Ages where we can highlight as a golden era of mutual coexistence? And that's number one. Second, can you also tell us, and if you speak to a policymaker, you outlined the principles and those ideological foundations of this theology, which is pragmatism, mysticism, apolitical practice of religion, plus coexistence.
Carry might coexist in middle way and melting pot.
If we move forward in terms of shaping the political agenda, what are key steps that a politician or a policymaker should take forward?
Okay, so the golden era of the Balkh Theological School is from the 2nd Islamic century until the invasion of Genghis Khan. This is the period because it started from the 2nd century against the Sharia-based theological of the Baghdad and Basra school. At the same time, the Sistan school of the Kharijite, which Balkh itself was destroyed by Yaqub al-Safar because of that impatient approach of Kharijite, of Sistan. So with the invasion of Genghis Khan, as everything collapsed, the Balkh Theological School was also collapsed because all madrasas and institutions were destroyed that time. The degeneration, when we talk about the Islamic degeneration, Balkh was also affected badly by that. So this period is the golden age of the Balkh Theological School, which influenced the Baghdad also that time, because the Mu'tazili, when we talk about, or the defenders of the reason in Islam, the principal scholars of Mu'tazili in Baghdad and Basra were the people from Balkh. For example, Nizam Balkhi was the philosopher of the Mu'tazila, Khayyat and all these other people. So with the invasion, the institution was destroyed, but as a practice, it remained in the behaviors of the people, in the rituals of the people until the Cold War. For the policymakers, what I believe is that we do not have a very tough job in front of us, because certain sets and mechanisms of making narratives are available for the policymakers. They know how to create a narrative, how to define the parameters of narrative, and how to implement that narrative in the society. So here you have an old narrative, and you have to update it. For example, when the question was posed about the secularism or the possible secularism from the Balkh Theological School, I say, if you have a terminology called Islamic in the political aspect, not philosophical aspect, again, I say. The Murji itself is a secular approach. So that secular approach of Murji methodology can be revived based on the mechanisms of making a narrative. Then you will have stories, you will have movies, you will have all kind of propaganda, so that the people they adopt again. And one good thing is that when I talk about the Balkh narrative, it has a legitimacy among the Muslims. If you talk about a new narrative, it does not have any legitimacy among the Islamists. But when you talk about the figures or the main figures of the Balkh narrative, the people, they accept them as the genuine or legitimized source of behaviors and thinking. Even Abu Mansur Maturidi himself, like he is a relevant figure, a relevant source. But how, for example, this coexistence of the Karami or the apolitical of Murji'i, or for example, the pragmatism of Sufism, all these different aspects or methodologies come together and make it as an update approach in the life of common Muslims. So that, I think, from a bottom-up approach can challenge the Islamist who always talks impatiently about, you know, me and others, or to counter others. That's what I believe. And in the end of my paper also, I proposed the same mechanism to put the old wine into new glass, so that is attractive for the modern man, but today's common Muslim. So that's easy.
Any question? Okay, so that's all I think for today. Really grateful for your time and great lecture. Yeah, we can end this program.
Yes, thank you for joining us all today.
My pleasure.
Thank you to those online who have been here. Thank you.